Thoughtlessly, he slipped away from the barn toward the forest, gripping the hoe handle so hard that his hands hurt. At first, when the trees surrounded him, he took comfort from them. They helped hide him from whatever the creatures were that had attacked the farm. He crept through the woods, though. Moonshadows
everyone's doing good
it
today.
began to seem as if the darkness of the forest changed and moved too. Trees loomed malevolently. Branches writhed toward him. But were they just trees and branches? He could almost hear the growling chuckles
Turn that down a
stifling their
little
throats
bit for you
while they
guys.
waited for him. Howls of Tam's pursuers no longer filled the night, but in the silence that replaced them, he flinched every time the wind scraped one limb against another. Lower and lower he crouched, moved more and more slowly. He hardly dared to breathe for fear he might be heard. Suddenly a hand closed over his mouth from behind, and an iron grip seized his wrist. Quickly he clawed over his shoulder with his free hand for some hold on the attacker. "Break my neck, lad," came Tam's hoarse whisper. Relief flooded him, turning his muscles to water. His father released him. He fell to his hands and knees, gasping as if he had run for miles. He dropped down beside him, leaning on one elbow. "Wouldn't have tried that if I had thought how much you've grown in the last few years," he said softly. His eyes shifted constantly as he spoke, keeping a sharp watch in the darkness. "I had to make sure you didn't speak out. Trollocs can hear like a dog. You better. Trollocs are just..." And let the words trail off. "Just a story. After tonight. Those things could be Trollocs or the Dark One himself, for all we know." "Sure," he whispered. "I mean, Trollocs. I'm sure. What brought them to the two rivers? I never saw one before tonight, but I've talked with many who have, so I know a little. Maybe enough to keep us alive. Listen closely. A Trolloc can see better than a man in the dark, but bright lights blind them, for a time at least. That may be the only reason we got away from so many. Some can track by scent or sound, but they're said to be lazy. If we can keep out of their hands long enough, they should give up." Made Rand feel only a little better. "In the stories, they hate men and serve the Dark One. Anything belongs in the Shepherd of the Night's flocks, lad. It is Trollocs. They kill for the pleasure of killing, so I've been told. But that's the end of my knowledge, except that they cannot be trusted unless they're afraid of you. And then not far." Rand shivered. He did not think he would want to meet anyone a Trolloc was afraid of. "Think they're still hunting for us?" "Maybe. Maybe not. Don't seem very smart. Once we got into the forest, I sent the ones after me off toward the mountains without much trouble." Cam fumbled it, then put his hand close to his face. "Just act as if they are, though. Hurt. Your voice down. It's just a scratch. There's nothing to be done about it now, anyway. At least the weather seems to be warming." He back with a heavy sigh. Perhaps it won't be too bad spending the night out. Back of his mind, Rand had just been thinking fond thoughts of his coat and cloak. The trees cut the worst of the wind, but what gusted through still sliced like a frozen knife. Evidently, he touched Tam's face and winced. "You're on fire. I have to get you to Nynaeve." "In a bit, lad. Don't have any time to waste. It's a long way in the dark." Scrambled to his feet and tried to pull his father up. A groan barely stifled by Tam's clenched teeth made Rand hastily ease him back down. "Let me rest a while, boy. I'm tired." And pounded his fist on his thigh. Snug in the farmhouse with a fire and blankets, plenty of water and willow bark, he might have been willing to wait for daybreak before hitching Bella and taking Tam into the village. Here was no fire, no blankets, no cart, and no Bella. But those things were still back at the house. If he could not carry Tam to them, perhaps he could bring some of them at least to Tam. The Trollocs were gone. They had to go sooner or later. He took the hoe handle, then dropped it. Instead, he drew Tam's sword. The blade gleamed dully in the pale moonlight. The long hilt felt odd in his hand. The weight and heft were strange. He slashed at the air a few times before stopping with a sigh. Slashing at air was easy. If he had to do it against a Trolloc, he was surely just as likely to run instead, or freeze stiff, so he could not move at all until the Trolloc swung one of those odd swords and... "Stop it. It's not helping anything." He started to rise. Tam caught his arm. Where are you going? The cart, he said gently, and blankets. He was shocked at how easily he pulled his father's hand from his sleeve. Rest. I'll be back. Full, Tam breathed. He could not see Tam's face in the moonlight, but he could feel his eyes on him. I will be. As careful as a mouse exploring a hawk's nest, he thought. As silently as another shadow, he slid into the darkness. He thought of all the times he had played tag in the woods with his friends as children, stalking one another, straining not to be heard until he put a hand on someone's shoulder. Somehow he could not make this seem the same. Creeping from tree to tree, he tried to make a plan, but by the time he reached the edge of the woods, he had made and discarded 10. Everything depended on whether or not the Trollocs were still there. If they were gone, he could simply walk up to the house and take what he needed. If they were still there, in that case, there was nothing for it but go back to Tam. He did not like it, but he could do Tam no good by getting killed. He peered toward the farm buildings. The barn and the sheep pen were only dark shapes in the moonlight. Light spilled from the front windows of the house, though, and through the open front door. Is the candle's father lit? Or are there Trollocs waiting? He jumped convulsively at a nighthawk's reedy cry, then sagged against a tree, shaking. He was getting him nowhere. Dropping to his belly, he began to crawl, holding the sword awkwardly before him. He kept his chin in the dirt all the way to the back of the sheep pen. Crouched against the stone wall, he listened. A sound disturbed the night. Carefully, he eased up enough to look over the wall. Nothing moved in the farmyard. No shadows flickered against the lit windows of the house or in the doorway. Behind the cart first, with the blankets and other things. It was the light that decided him. The barn was dark. Anything could be waiting inside, and he would have no way of knowing until it was too late. At least he would be able to see what was inside the house. He started to lower himself again. He stopped suddenly. There was no sound. Most of the sheep might have settled down already and gone back to sleep, though it was not likely. But a few were always awake, even in the middle of the night, bustling about, bleating now and again. He could barely make out the shadowy mounds of sheep on the ground. One lay almost beneath him. Trying to make no noise, he hoisted himself onto the wall until he could stretch out a hand to the dim shape. His fingers touched curly wool, then wetness. Sheep did not move. Breath left him in a rush as he pushed back, almost dropping the sword as he fell to the ground outside the pen. Kill for fun. Quickly, he scrubbed the wetness from his hand in the dirt. So he told himself that nothing had changed. The Trollocs had done their butchery and gone. Repeating that in his mind, he crawled down across the farmyard, keeping as low as he could, but trying to watch every direction, too. He had never thought he would envy an earthworm. In front of the house, he lay close beside the wall, beneath the broken window, and listened. The dull thudding of blood in his ears was the loudest sound he heard. Slowly, he reared up and peered inside. The teapot lay upside down in the ashes on the hearth. Splintered, broken wood littered the room. Not a single piece of furniture remained whole. Even the table rested at an angle, 2 legs hacked to rough stubs. Every drawer had been pulled out and smashed. Every cupboard and cabinet stood open, many doors hanging by one hinge. Their contents were strewn over the wreckage, and everything was dusted with white. Flour and salt, to judge from the slashed sacks tossed down by the fireplace. 4 twisted bodies made a tangle in the remnants of the furnishings. Trollocs. He recognized one by its ram's horns. The others were much the same, even in their differences. A repulsive melange of human faces distorted by muzzles, horns, feathers, and fur. Their hands, almost human, only made it worse. 2 wore boots, the others had hooves. He watched without blinking until his eyes burned. But the Trollocs moved. Had to be dead. Tam was waiting. Ran in through the front door and stopped, gagging at the stench. A stable that had not been mucked out in months was the only thing he could think of that might come close to matching it. Vile smears defiled the walls. As he breathed through his mouth, he hurriedly began poking through the mess on the floor. There'd been a water bag in one of the cupboards. A scraping sound behind him sent a chill to his marrow, and he spun, almost falling over the remains of the table. He caught himself and moaned behind teeth that would have chattered had he not had them clenched until his jaw ached. The Trollocs was getting to its feet. A wolf's muzzle jutted out between sunken eyes. Flat, emotionless eyes, and all too human. Hairy, pointed ears twitched incessantly. It stepped over one of its dead companions on sharp goat hooves. The same black mail the others wore rasped against leather trousers, and one of the huge, scythe-curved swords swung at its side. It muttered something, guttural and sharp, then said, "Others go away. Narg stay. Narg smart." The words were distorted and hard to understand, coming from a mouth never meant for human speech. Its tone was meant to be soothing, he thought, but he could not take his eyes off the stained teeth, long and sharp, that flashed every time the creature spoke. "Narg know some come back sometime. Narg wait. No need sword. Put sword down." Till the Trolloc spoke, Rand did not realize that he held Tam's sword wavering before him in both hands, its point aimed at the huge creature. It towered head and shoulders above him with a chest and arms to dwarf Master Luhan. "Narg no hurt." It took a step closer, gesturing. "You put sword down." The dark hair on the backs of its hands was thick like fur. "Stay back," Rand said, wishing his voice was steadier. "Why did you do this? Why?" "Veljete Garuga." Snarl quickly became a toothy smile. "Sword down. Narg no hurt. Myrddraal want talk you." Flash of emotion crossed the distorted face. "Here. Others come back. You talk, Myrddraal." Took another step, one big hand coming to rest on its own sword hilt. "You put sword down." And wet his lips. Myrddraal. The worst of the stories was walking tonight. If a Thade was coming, it made a Trolloc pale by comparison. He had to get away. But if the Trolloc drew that massive blade, he would not have a chance. He forced his lips into a shaky smile. "All right." Grip tightening on the sword, he let both hands drop to his sides. "I'll talk." The wolf's smile became a snarl, and the Trolloc lunged for him. Rand had not thought anything that big could move so fast. Desperately, he brought his sword up. The monstrous body crashed into him, slamming him against the wall. Breath left his lungs in one gasp. He fought for air as they fell to the floor together, the Trolloc on top. Frantically, he struggled beneath the crushing weight, trying to avoid thick hands groping for him and snapping jaws. Abruptly, the Trolloc spasmed and was still. Battered and bruised, half suffocated by the bulk on top of him, for a moment Rand could only lie there in disbelief. But he came to his senses, though, enough to writhe out from under the body at least. Body it was. The bloodied blade of Tam's sword stood out from the center of the Trolloc's back. He had gotten it up in time after all. Blood covered Rand's hands as well, and made a blackish smear across the front of his shirt. His stomach churned, and he swallowed hard to keep from being sick. He shook as hard as he had in the worst of his fear, but this time in relief at still being alive. Others come back, the Trolloc had said. The Trollocs would be returning to the farmhouse. And a Myrddraal, a Thade. The stories said Thades were 20 feet tall, with eyes of fire, and they rode shadows like horses. When a Thade turned sideways, it disappeared, and no wall could stop them. He had to do what he had come for and get away quickly. With the effort, he heaved the Trolloc's body over to get the sword, and almost ran when open eyes stared at him. It took him a minute to realize they were staring through the glaze of death. He wiped his hands on a tattered rag, it had been one of Tam's shirts only that morning, and tugged the blade free. Cleaning the sword, he reluctantly dropped the rag on the floor. There was no time for neatness, he thought, with a laugh that he had to clamp his teeth shut to stop. He did not see how they could ever clean the house well enough for it to be lived in again. Horrible stench had probably already soaked right into the timbers. There was no time to think of that. No time for neatness. No time for anything, maybe. He was sure he was forgetting any number of things they would need, but Tam was waiting and the Trollocs were coming back. He gathered what he could think of on the run. Blankets from the bedrooms upstairs and clean clothes to bandage Tam's wound. Their cloaks and coats. A water bag that he carried when he took the sheep to pasture. a clean shirt. He not knew when he would have time to change, but he wanted to get out of his blood-smeared shirt at the first opportunity. The small bags of willow bark and their other medicines were part of a dark, muddy-looking pile he could not bring himself to touch. The bucket of the water Tam had brought in still stood by the fireplace, miraculously unspilled and untouched. He filled the water bag from it, gave his hands a hasty wash and the rest, and made one more quick search for anything he might have forgotten. He found his bow among the wreckage, broken cleanly in two at the thickest point. Shuddered as he let the pieces fall. What he had gathered already would have to do, he decided. Quickly, he piled everything outside the door. Last thing before leaving the house, he dug a shuttered lantern from the mess on the floor. It still held oil. Lighting it from one of the candles, he closed the shutters, partly against the wind, but mostly to keep from drawing attention, and hurried outside with the lantern in one hand and the sword in the other. He was not sure what he would find in the barn. The sheep pen kept him from hoping too much. But he needed the cart to get Tam to Emmons Field, and for the cart he needed Bella. Necessity made him hope a little. The barn doors stood open, one creaking on its hinges as it shifted in the wind. The interior looked as it always had, at first. Then his eyes fell on empty stalls, the stall doors ripped from their hinges. Bella and the cow were gone. Quickly he went to the back of the barn. The cart lay on its side.
Hey, Panda Cat, how you doing?
One shaft
Hope you're having
was
a
only
good
foot
night.
long stump. The despair he had been holding at bay filled him. He was not sure he could carry Tam as far as the village, even if his father could bear to be carried. The pain of it might kill Tam more quickly than the fever. Still, it was the only chance left. Done all he could do here. He turned to go, his eyes fell on the hacked-off cart shaft lying on the straw-strewn floor. He smiled. Hurriedly, he set the lantern and the sword on the straw-covered floor, and in the next instant he was wrestling with the cart, tipping it back over to fall upright with a snap of more breaking spokes, then throwing his shoulder into it to heave it over on the other side.
Hell yeah, Panda Cat.
Damaged
That's
shaft
badass.
stood straight out. Catching up the sword, he hacked at the well-seasoned ash. To his pleased surprise, great chips flew with his strokes, and he cut through as quickly as he could have with a good axe. When the shaft fell free, he looked at the sword blade in wonder. Even the best sharpened axe would have dulled chopping through aged wood, but the sword was as sharp as ever. Touched the edge with his thumb. The blade was still razor sharp. He had no time for wonder. Blowing out the lantern, there was no need to have the barn burned down on top of everything else. He gathered up the shaft and ran back to get what he had left in the house. Altogether, it made an awkward burden. Not a heavy one, but hard to balance and manage. The cart shafts shifting and twisting in his arms as he stumbled across the field. Back in the forest, they were even worse, catching on trees and knocking him half off his feet. They would have been easier to drag, but that would leave a clear trail behind him. He intended to wait as long as possible before doing that. Tam was right where he had left him.
Hell yeah, Panda Cat.
Hoped it was
That's
sleep.
badass.
Suddenly fearful, he dropped his burdens and put a hand to his father's face. Tam still breathed, but the fever was worse. Touch roused Tam, but only into a hazy wakefulness. "Is that you, boy?" he breathed. "Worried about you. Dreams of days gone. Nightmares." Murmuring softly, he drifted off again. "Worry," Rand said. He laid Tam's coat and cloak over him to keep off the wind. "I'll get you to Nine Neve just as quickly as I can." As he went on, as much to reassure himself as for Tam's benefit, he peeled off his blood-stained shirt, hardly even noticing the cold in his haste to be rid of it, and hurriedly pulled on a clean one. Throwing his old
Hell
shirt
yeah,
away,
appreciate it, Panda
he had
Cat.
just had a bath. "We'll be safe in the village in no time, and the wisdom will set
Definitely
everything
appreciate
right.
that, brother.
We'll see. Everything's going to be all right." That thought was like a beacon as he pulled on his coat and bent to tend Tam's wound. They would be safe once they reached the village, and Nynaeve would cure Tam. Just had to get him there. Chapter 6. Westwood. Moonlight, Rand could not really see what he was doing, but Tam's wound seemed to be only a shallow gash along the ribs, no longer than the palm of his hand. He shook his head in disbelief. He had seen his father take more of an injury than that, and not even stop work except to wash it off. So he searched Tam from head to foot for something bad enough to account for the fever. But the one cut was all he could find. Small as it was, that lone cut was still grave enough. The flesh around it burned to the touch. It was even hotter than the rest of Tam's body. And the rest of him was
this one.
Rand's jaws clench. Scalding fever like that could kill or leave a man a
Look,
husk.
MJ Arsenal one.
He soaked a cloth with water from the skin and laid it across Tam's forehead. He tried to be gentle about washing and bandaging the gash on his father's ribs, but soft groans still interrupted Tam's low muttering. Stark branches loomed around them, threatening as they shifted in the wind. Hopefully the Trollocs would go on their way when they failed to find Tam and him. When they came back to the farmhouse and found it still empty. He tried to make himself believe it, but the wanton destruction at the house, the senselessness of it, left little room for belief of that sort. Thinking they would give up short of killing everyone and everything they could find was dangerous, a foolish chance he could not afford to take. Trollocs. Light above, Trollocs. Creatures out of the Gleeman's Tale coming out of the night to bash in the door. And a fade. Light shine on me, a fade. Abruptly, he realized he was holding the untied ends of the bandage in motionless hands. Frozen like a rabbit that's seen a hawk's shadow, he thought scornfully. With an angry shake of his head, he finished tying the bandage around Tam's chest. Knowing what he had to do, even getting on with it, did not stop him being afraid. When the Trollocs came back, they would surely begin searching the forest around the farm for some trace of the people who had escaped them. The body of the one he had killed would tell them those people were not far off. Who knew what a fade would do, or could do? On top of that, his father's comment about Trollocs hearing was as loud in his mind as if Tam had just said it. He found himself resisting the urge to put a hand over Tam's mouth to still his groans and murmurs. I'm tracked by scent. What can I do about that? Nothing. He did not waste time worrying over problems he could do nothing about. You have to keep quiet, he whispered in his father's ear. The Trollocs will be back. He spoke in hushed, hoarse tones. You're still lovely, Kari. And grimaced. His mother had been dead for 15 years. If Tam was still alive, then the fever was even worse than Rand had thought. Could he be kept from speaking, now that silence might mean life? Mother wants you to be quiet, Rand whispered. Paused to clear his throat of a sudden tightness. It had gentle hands. He remembered that much. I want you to be quiet. Here, drink. Tam gulped thirstily from the water skin, but after a few swallows, he turned his head aside and began murmuring softly again, too low for Rand to understand. He hoped it was too low to be heard by hunting Trollocs, too. Silly, he got on with what was needed. 3 of the blankets he wove around and between the shafts cut from the cart, driving a makeshift litter. He would only be able to carry one end, letting the other drag on the ground, but it would have to do. Last blanket, he cut a long strip with his belt knife, then tied one end of the strip to each of the shafts. As gently as he could, he lifted Tam onto the litter, wincing with every moan. His father had always seemed indestructible. Nothing could harm him, nothing could stop him, or even slow him down. For him to be in this condition almost robbed Rand of what courage he had managed to gather. But he had to keep on. That was all that kept him moving. Had to. Tam finally lay in the litter. Rand hesitated, then took the sword belt from his father's waist. When he fastened it around himself, it felt odd there. It made him feel odd. Sheath and sword together only weighed a few pounds, but when he sheathed the blade, it seemed to drag at him like a great weight. Angrily, he berated himself. This was no time or place for foolish fancies. It was only a big day. Many times had he daydreamed about wearing a sword and having adventures. If he could kill one Trolloc with it, he could surely fight off any others as well. Only he knew all too well that what had happened in the farmhouse had been the purest luck. And his daydream adventures had never included his teeth chattering, or running for his life through the night, or his father at the point of death. Until he tucked the last blanket around Tam, and laid the water skin and the rest of the cloths beside his father on the litter. With a deep breath, he knelt between the shafts and lifted the strip of blanket over his head. It settled across his shoulders and under his arms. He gripped the shafts and straightened. Most of the weight was on his shoulders. It did not seem like very much. Trying to keep a smooth face, he set out for Emmons Field, the litter scraping along behind him. He had already decided to make his way to the quarry road and follow that to the village. The danger would almost certainly be greater along the road, but Tam would receive no help at all if he got them lost trying to find his way through the woods in the dark. In the darkness, he was almost out onto the quarry road before he knew it. When he realized where he was, his throat tightened like a fist. Hurriedly, he turned the litter around and dragged it back into the trees away, then stopped to catch his breath and let his heart stop pounding. Still panting, he turned east toward Emmons Field. Traveling through the trees was more difficult than taking Tam down the road, and the night surely did not help. But going out onto the road itself would be madness. The idea was to reach the village without meeting any Trollocs, without even seeing any if he had his wish. He had to assume the Trollocs were still hunting them. Sooner or later, they would realize the two had set off for the village. That was the exact place to go, and the quarry road the most likely route. True, he found himself closer to the road than he liked. The night and the shadows under the trees seemed awfully bare cover in which to hide from the eyes of anyone traveling along it. Moonlight filtering through bare branches gave only enough illumination to fool his eyes into thinking they saw what was underfoot. Roots threatened to trip him at every step. Old brambles snagged his legs, and sudden dips or rises in the ground had him half falling as his foot met nothing but air where he expected firm earth, or stumbling when his toe struck dirt while still moving forward. His mutterings broke into a sharp groan whenever one of the shafts bumped too quickly over a root or rock. Uncertainty made him peer into the darkness until his eyes burned. Listen as he had never listened before. Every scrape of branch against branch, every rustle of pine needles, brought him to a halt, ears straining, hardly daring to breathe for fear he might not hear some warning sound, for fear he might hear that sound. Only when he was sure it was just the wind would he go on. Holy weariness crept into his arms and legs, driven home by a night wind that mocked his cloak and coat. The weight of the litter, so little at the start, now tried to pull him to the ground. Stumbles were no longer all from tripping. The almost constant struggle not to fall took as much out of him as did the actual work of pulling the litter. He had been up before dawn to begin his chores, and even with the trip to Emmons Field, he had done almost a full day's work. On any normal night, he would be resting before the fireplace, reading one of Tam's small collection of books before going to bed. The sharp chill soaked into his bones, and his stomach reminded him that he had had nothing to eat since Mr. Salvier's honey cakes. He muttered to himself, angry at not taking some food at the farm. A few minutes more could not have made any difference. A few minutes to find some bread and cheese. Trollocs would not have come back in just a few minutes more. Or just the bread. Of course, Mr. Salvier would insist on putting a hot meal in front of him once they reached the inn. A steaming plate of her thick lamb stew, probably. And some of that bread she had been baking. And lots of hot tea. Came over the Dragon Wall like a flood, Tam said suddenly, in a strong, angry voice, and washed the land with blood. How many died for Lemon's sin? It almost fell from surprise. Wearily, he lowered the litter to the ground and untangled himself. The strip of blanket left a burning groove in his shoulders. Struggling to work the knots out, he knelt beside Tam. Fumbling for the water bag, he peered through the trees, trying vainly in the dim moonlight to see up and down the road, not 20 paces away. Nothing moved there but shadows. Nothing but shadows. Isn't any flood of Trollocs, Father. Not now, anyway. We'll be safe in Emmons Field soon. Drink a little water. Tam brushed aside the water bag with an arm that seemed to have regained all of its strength. He seized Rand's collar, pulling him close enough to feel the heat of his father's fever in his own cheek. Called them savages, Tam said urgently. The fools said they could be swept aside like rubbish. How many battles lost? How many cities burned before they faced the truth? Before the nations stood together against them? Pushed his hold on Rand, and sadness filled his voice. Field at Marath, carpeted with the dead, and no sound but the cries of ravens and the buzzing of flies. Topless towers of Carine, burning in the night like torches. All the way to the shining walls they burned and slew before they were turned back. All the way to... And clapped a hand over his father's mouth. Sound came again, a rhythmic thudding, directionless in the trees. Then growing stronger again as the wind shifted. Running, he turned his head slowly, trying to decide from where it came. A flicker of motion caught the corner of his eye, and in an instant he was crouched over Tam. Startled to feel the hilt of the sword clutched tight in his hand, but most of him concentrated on the quarry road, as if the road were the only real thing in the entire world. Hovering shadows to the east slowly resolved themselves into a horse and rider, followed up the road by tall, bulky shapes trotting to keep up with the animal. The pale light of the moon glittered from spearheads and axe blades. Rand never even considered that they might be villagers coming to help. Knew what they were. Could feel it, like grit scraping his bones, even before they drew close enough for moonlight to reveal the hooded cloak swathing the horseman, cloak that hung undisturbed by the wind. All of the shapes appeared black in the night, and the horse's hooves made the same sounds that any others would. But Rand knew this horse from any other. Behind the dark rider came nightmare forms with horns and muzzles and beaks. Trollocs in a double file, all in steps, boots and hooves striking the ground at the same instant as if obeying a single mind. Rand counted 20 as they ran past. He wondered what kind of man would dare turn his back on so many Trollocs. Or on one, for that matter. Trotting column disappeared westward, thumping footfalls fading into the darkness. But Rand remained where he was, not moving a muscle except to breathe. Something told him to be certain, absolutely certain. They were gone before he moved. At long last, he drew a deep breath and began to straighten. This time the horse made no sound. In eerie silence, the dark rider returned, his shadowy mount stopping every few steps as it walked slowly back down the road. The wind gusted higher, moaning through the trees. The horseman's cloak. Whenever the horse that hooded head swung aside as the rider peered into the forest, searching. Exactly opposite Rand, the horse stopped again, the shattered opening of the hood turning toward where he crouched above his father. Rand's hand tightened convulsively on the sword hilt. Felt the gaze, just as he had that morning, and shivered again from the hatred, even if he could not see it. The shrouded man hated everyone and everything. Everything that lived. Despite the cold wind, sweat beaded on Rand's face. The horse was moving on, a few soundless steps, and stopped, until all Rand could see was a barely distinguishable blur in the night far down the road. It could have been anything, but he had not taken his eyes off it for a second. If he lost it, he was afraid the next time he saw the black-cloaked rider might be when that silent horse was on top of him. Abruptly, the shadow was rushing back, passing him in a silent gallop. The rider looked only ahead of him as he sped westward into the night, toward the mountains of mist, toward the farm. And sagged, gulping air and scrubbing cold sweat off his face with his sleeve. He did not care any more about why the Trollocs had come. If he never found out why, that would be fine, just as long as it was all ended. The shake, he gathered himself, hastily checking his father. Tam was still murmuring, but so softly, Rand could not make out the words. He tried to give him a drink, but the water spilled over his father's chin. Tam coughed and choked on the trickle that made it into his mouth, then began muttering again, as if there had not been any interruption, and splashed a little more water on the cloth on Tam's forehead, pushed the water bag back on the litter, and scrambled between the shafts again. He started out as if he had had a good night's sleep, but the new strength did not last long. Fear masked his tiredness in the beginning, but though the fear remained, the mask melted away quickly. Soon he was back to stumbling forward, trying to ignore hunger and aching muscles. He concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other.
Hey, Soy, how you doing?
In his mind, he pictured Emmons Field, shutters thrown back.
Not much, just listening to a book and smoking a bowl before I try to get some sleep.
With James Folly and Heron on the Wing. Harald Luhan would have one too many brandies and start singing "The Wind in the Barley" in a voice like a bullfrog. He always did, until his wife managed to shush him. And Sen Bui would decide to prove he could still dance as well as ever. And Matt would have something planned that would not quite happen the way he intended. Everybody would know he was responsible, even if no one could prove it. He could almost smile thinking about how it would be. After a time, Tam spoke up again. Vendasora. It said it makes no seed, but they brought a cutting to Kyrene, a sapling. A royal gift of wonder for the king. He sounded angry. He was barely loud enough for Rand to understand. Anyone who could hear him would be able to hear the litter scraping across the ground, too. Rand kept on, only half listening. Never made peace. Never. They brought a sapling as a sign of peace. 500 years it grew. 500 years of peace with those who make no peace with strangers. Did he cut it down? Why? Blood was the price for Avendor Aldera. Blood the price for Lamin's pride. He faded off into muttering once more. Tiredly, Rand wondered what fever dream Tam could be having now. And Desora? The Tree of Life was supposed to have all sorts of miraculous qualities, but none of the stories mentioned any sapling, or any they. It was only the one, and that belonged to the Green Man. That morning he might have felt foolish at musing over the Green Man and the Tree of Life. They were only stories. Are they? Trollocs were just stories this morning. Maybe all the stories were as real as the news the peddlers and merchants brought. All the gleemen's tales and all the stories told at night in front of the fireplace. He might actually meet the Green Man, or an Ogier giant, or a wild, black-veiled Aiel man. Tam was talking again, he realized, sometimes only murmuring, sometimes loud enough to understand. From time to time he stopped to pant for breath, then went down as if he thought he had been speaking the whole time. Battles are always hot, even in the snow. Sweat heat, blood heat. Only death is cool. Snow in the mountain. Only place didn't stink of death. Had to get away from the smell of it, sight of it. Heard a baby cry. Women fight alongside the men, sometimes. But why they had let her come, I don't. Gave birth there alone, before she died of her wounds. But the child with her cloak, with the wind, blown the cloak away. I blew with the cold. Have been dead too. Lying in the snow. I couldn't just leave a child. The children of our own. Always knew you wanted children. Will you take it to your heart, Kari? Yes, lass. And is a good name. A good name. Suddenly, Rand's legs lost the little strength they had. Stumbling, he fell to his knees. Tam moaned with the jolt, and the strip of blanket cut into Rand's shoulders, but he was not aware of either. If a Trolloc had leaped up in front of him right then, he would have just stared at it. He looked over his shoulder at Tam, who had sunk back into wordless murmurs. Her dreams, he thought dully. He was always doing bad dreams. And this was a night for nightmares. Stretching back a hand to touch him. It was worse. Grimly, he struggled to his feet. But Rand refused to listen to anyone. His weight against the improvised harness, he tried to put all of his mind into taking one leaden step after another, into reaching the safety of Emmons Field. But he could not stop the echo in the back of his mind. My father. It was just a fever dream. He's my father. It was just a fever dream. Who am I? 7. Out of the woods. Light came while Rand still trudged. At first, he did not really see. When he finally did, he stared at the fading darkness in surprise. No matter what his eyes told him, he could hardly believe he had spent all night trying to travel the distance from the farm to Emmons Field. Of course, the boy rode by day, rocks was a far cry from the woods. On the other hand, it seemed days since he had seen the black-cloaked rider on the road, weeks since he and Tam had gone in for their
show you the smoking roach
weed. No longer felt the strip of cloth digging into his shoulders.
It does its job.
In his shoulders except numbness, nor in his feet, for that matter.
Especially for a nighttime smoke.
It was another matter. Breath came in labored pants that had long since set his throat and lungs to burning, and hunger twisted his stomach into queasy sickness. Had fallen silent before. Rand was not sure how long it had been since the murmurs ceased, but he did not dare halt now to check on Tam. If he stopped, he would never be able to force himself to start out again. Anyway, whatever Tam did, he could do nothing beyond what he did. The only hope lay ahead in the village. He tried wearily to increase his pace, but his wooden legs continued their slow plod. He barely even noticed the cold or the wind. Vaguely, he caught the smell of wood smoke. At least he was almost there if he could smell the village chimneys. A tired smile had only begun on his face, though, when it turned to a frown. Smoke lay heavy in the air. Too heavy. With the weather, a fire might well be blazing away on every hearth in the village, but the smoke was still too strong. In his mind, he saw again the Trollocs on the road. Trollocs coming from the east. Field. trying to make out the first houses, and ready to shout for help at the first sight of anyone, even send Bowie or one of the Coplans. A small voice in the back of his head told him to hope someone there could still give help. Suddenly a house became visible through the last bare-branched trees, and it was all he could do to keep his feet moving. Turning to sharp despair, he staggered into the village. Charred piles of rubble stood in the places of half the houses of Emmonsfield. Soot-coated brick chimneys thrust like dirty fingers from heaps of blackened timbers. Thin wisps of smoke still rose from the ruins. Grimy-faced villagers, some yet in their night clothes, poked through the ashes, here pulling free a cookpot, there simply prodding forlornly at the wreckage with a stick. What little had been rescued from the flames dotted the streets. Tall mirrors and polished sideboards and high chests stood in the dust among chairs and tables, buried under bedding, cooking utensils, and meager piles of clothing and personal belongings. The destruction seemed scattered at random through the village. 5 houses marched untouched in one row, while in another place, a lone survivor stood surrounded by desolation. On the far side of the Wine Spring Water, the 3 huge Beltane bonfires roared, tended by a cluster of men. Columns of black smoke with the wind, flecked by careless sparks. One of Master Alvere's Duran stallions was dragging something Rand could not make out over the ground toward the wagon bridge and the flames. Before he was well out of the trees, a sooty-faced Harald Luhan hurried to him, clutching a woodsman's axe in one thick-fingered hand. The burly blacksmith's ash-smeared nightshirt hung to his boots, the angry red welt of a burn across his chest showing through a ragged tear. He dropped to one knee beside the litter. Tam's eyes were closed, and his breathing came low and hard. "Frolics, boy?" Luhan asked in a smoke-hoarse voice. Here too. Well, we may have been luckier than anyone has a right to be, if you can credit it. He needs the wisdom. Now, where in the light is she? Egwene! Egwene, running by with her arms full of bedsheets torn into bandages, looked around at them without slowing. Her eyes stared at something in the far distance. Dark circles made them appear even larger than they actually were. Then she saw Rand and stopped, drawing a shuddering breath. Oh no, Rand, not your father. Is he? Come, I'll take you to Nynaeve. Rand was too tired, too stunned to speak. All through the night, Emmonsfield had been a haven where he and Tam would be safe. Now all he could seem to do was stare in dismay at her smoke-stained dress. He noticed odd details as if they were very important. Buttons down the back of her dress were done up crookedly, and her hands were clean. He wondered why her hands were clean when smudges of soot marked her cheeks. Master Luhan seemed to understand what had come over him. Laying his axe across the shafts, the blacksmith picked up the rear of the litter and gave it a gentle push, prodding him to follow Egwene. He stumbled after her as if walking in his sleep. Briefly, he wondered how Master Luhan knew the creatures were Trollocs, but it was a fleeting thought. If Tam could recognize them, there was no reason why Harald Luhan could not. All the stories are real, he muttered. So it seems, lad, the blacksmith said. So it seems. He'd only half heard. He was concentrating on following Egwene's slender shape. Pulled himself together just enough to wish she would hurry, though in truth, she was keeping her pace to what the 2 men could manage with their burden. She led them halfway down the green to the Calder house. Char blackened the edges of its thatch, and smut stained the whitewashed walls. Of the houses on either side, only the foundation stones were left, and 2 piles of ash and burned timbers. One had been the house of Baron Thane, one of the Miller's brothers. The other had been Abel Cotham's, Matt's father. Even the chimneys had toppled. Wait here, Egwene said, and gave them a look as if expecting an answer. When they only stood there, she muttered something under her breath, then dashed inside. Matt, Rand said. Is he? He's alive, the blacksmith said. He set down his end of the litter and straightened slowly. I saw him only a little while ago. It's a wonder any of us are alive. The way they came after my house in the forge, you'd have thought I had gold and jewels in there. All's but cracked one's skull with a frying pan. She took one look at the ashes of our house this morning and set out hunting around the village with the biggest hammer she could dig out of what's left of the forge, just in case any of them hid instead of running away. I could almost pity the thing if she finds one. Nodded to the Calder house. Mistress Calder and a few others took in some of those who were hurt. The ones with no home of their own still standing. When the Wisdoms seen Tam, we'll find him a bed. The inn, maybe. The mayor offered it already. But Nynaeve said the hurt folk would heal better if there weren't so many of them together. Rand sank to his knees. Shrugging out of his blanket harness, he wearily busied himself with checking Tam's covers. Tam never moved or made a sound, even when Rand's wooden hands jostled him. But he was still breathing, at least. My father. The other was just the fever talking. What if they come back? He said dully. The wheel weaves as the wheel wills, Master Luhan said uneasily. If they come back, well, they're gone now. So we pick up the pieces, build up what's been torn down. He sighed, his face going slack as he knuckled the small of his back. For the first time, Rand realized that the heavy-set man was as tired as he was himself, if not more so. The blacksmith looked at the village, shaking his head. I don't suppose today will be much of a bell time, but we'll make it through. We always have. Abruptly, he took up his axe, and his face firmed. There's work waiting for me. Don't you worry, lad. The Wisdom will take good care of him, and the light will take care of us all. And if the light doesn't, well, we'll just take care of ourselves. Remember, we're Two Rivers folk. Still on his knees, Rand looked at the village as the blacksmith walked away. Really looked for the first time. Master Luhan was right, he thought, and was surprised that he was not surprised by what he saw. People still dug in the ruins of their homes, but even in the short time he had been there, more of them had begun to move with a sense of purpose. He could almost feel the growing determination. But, he wondered, they had seen Trollocs. Had they seen the black-cloaked rider? Had they felt his hatred? Nynaeve and Egwene appeared from the Calder house, and he sprang to his feet. Or rather, he tried to spring to his feet. It was more of a stumbling lurch that almost put him on his face in the dust. The Wisdom dropped to her knees beside the litter without giving him so much as a glance. Her face and dress were even dirtier than Egwene's, and the same dark circles lined her eyes, though her hands too were clean. She felt Tam's face and thumbed open his eyelids. With a frown, she pulled down the coverings and eased the bandage aside to look at the wound. Before Rand could see what lay underneath, she had replaced the wadded cloth. Sighing, she smoothed the blanket and cloak back up to Tam's neck with a gentle touch, as if tucking a child in for the night. There's nothing I can do, she said. She had to put her hands on her knees to straighten up. I'm sorry, Rand. For a moment he stood, not understanding, as she started back to the house. Then he scrambled after her and pulled her around to face him. He's dying, he cried. I know, she said simply, and he sagged with the matter-of-factness of it. You have to do it. You have to. You're the Wisdom. Pain twisted her face, but only for an instant. Then she was all hollow-eyed resolve again, her voice emotionless and firm. Yes, I am. I know what I can do with my medicines, and I know when it's too late. Don't you think I would do something if I could? But I can't. I can't, Rand. And there are others who need me. People I can help. I brought him to you as quickly as I could, he mumbled. With the village in ruins, there had been the wisdom for hope. With that gone, he was empty. I know you did, she said gently. She touched his cheek with her hand. It isn't your fault. You did the best anyone could. I am sorry, Rand, but I have others to tend to. Our troubles are just beginning, I'm afraid. Vacantly, he stared after her until the door of the house closed behind her. He could not make any thought come, except that she would not help. Suddenly, he was knocked back as Egwene cannoned into him, throwing her arms around him. Her hug was hard enough to bring a grunt from him any other time. Now he only looked silently at the door, behind which his hopes had vanished. I'm so sorry, Rand, she said against his chest. Light, I wish there was something I could do. Numbly, he put his arms around her. I know. I have to do something, Egwene. I don't know what, but I can't just let him... His voice broke, and she hugged him harder. Egwene! That night, Egwene jumped. Egwene, I need you. And wash your hands again. pushed herself free from Rand's arms. She needs my help, Rand. Egwene! Cuddy heard a sob as she spun away from him. Then she was gone, and he was left alone beside the litter. For a moment he looked down at Tam, feeling nothing but hollow helplessness. Suddenly his face hardened. The mayor will know what to do, he said, lifting the shafts once more. The mayor will know. Bran al'Vere always knew what to do. With weary obstinacy, he set out for the Wine Spring Inn. Another of the Duran stallions passed him, its harness straps tied around the ankles of a big shape, draped with a dirty blanket. Arms covered with coarse hair dragged in the dirt behind the blanket, and one corner was pushed up to reveal a goat's horn. The Two Rivers was no place for stories to become horribly real. If Trollocs belonged anywhere, it was in the world outside, for places where they had Aes Sedai and false dragons, and the light alone knew what else come to life out of the tales of Gleeman. Not the Two Rivers, not Emond's Field. As he made his way down the green, people called to him, some from the ruins of their homes, asking if they could help. He heard them only as murmurs in the background, even when they walked alongside him for a distance as they spoke. Without really thinking about it, he managed words that said he needed no help, that everything was being taken care of. When they left him, with worried looks and sometimes a comment about sending Nynaeve to him, he noticed that just as little. All he let himself be aware of was the purpose he had fixed in his head. Bran al'Vere could do something to help Tam. What that could be, he tried not to dwell on. But the mayor would be able to do something, to think of something. Inn had almost completely escaped the destruction that had taken half the village. A few scorch marks marred its walls, but the red roof tiles glittered in the sunlight as brightly as ever. All that was left of the peddler's wagon, though, were blackened iron wheel rims leaning against the charred wagon box, now on the ground. The big round hoops that had held up the canvas cover slanted crazily, each at a different angle. Tom Merrilin sat cross-legged on the old foundation stones, carefully snipping singed edges from the patches on his cloak with a pair of small scissors. He set down cloak and scissors when Rand drew near. Without asking if Rand needed or wanted help, he hopped down and picked up the back of the litter. Inside? Of course. Don't you worry, boy. Your wisdom will take care of him. I've watched her work since last night, and she is a deft touch and a sure Could be a lot worse. Some died last night. Not many, perhaps, but any at all are too many for me. Old Fane just disappeared, and that's the worst of all. Trollocs will eat anything. You should thank the light your father is still here, and alive for the wisdom to heal. Rand blotted out the words, "He is my father," reducing the voice to meaningless sound that he noticed no more than a fly's buzzing. He could not bear any more sympathy, any more attempts to boost his spirits. Not now. Not until Bran al'Vere told him how to help Tam. Suddenly he found himself facing something scrawled on the inn door. A curving line scratched with a charred stick. A charcoal teardrop balanced on its point. So much had happened that it hardly surprised him to find the dragon's fang marked on the door of the Wine Spring Inn. Why anyone would want to accuse the innkeeper or his family of evil, or bring the inn bad luck, was beyond him. But the night had convinced him of one thing. Anything was possible. Anything at all. At a push from the Gleeman, he lifted the latch and went in. The common room was empty except for Bran al'Vere, and cold too, for no one had found time to lay a fire. The mayor sat at one of the tables, dipping his pen in an inkwell with a frown of concentration on his face, and his gray-fringed head bent over a sheet of parchment. Nightshirt tucked hastily into his trousers, and bagging around his considerable waist, he absently scratched at one bare foot with the toes of the other. His feet were dirty, as if he had been outside more than once without bothering about boots, despite the cold. "What's your trouble?" he demanded without looking up. "Be quick with it. I have 24 things to do right this minute, and more that should have been done an hour ago. So I have little time or patience. Well, out with it." "Master al'Vere," Rand said. "It's my father." The mayor's head jerked up. "Rand! Tam!" He threw down the pen and knocked over his chair as he leaped up. "Perhaps the light hasn't abandoned us altogether. I was afraid you were both dead." Bella galloped into the village an hour after the Trollocs left, lathered and blowing as if she'd run all the way from the farm. And I thought, no time for that now. We'll take him upstairs. He seized the rear of the litter and pulled the Gleeman out of the way. "You go get the wisdom, Master Merrilin, And tell her I said hurry, or I'll know the reason why. Rest easy, Tam. We'll soon have you in a good soft bed. Go, Gleeman, go! Marilyn vanished through the doorway before Rand could speak. And Eve wouldn't do anything. She said she couldn't help him. I hoped you'd think of something. Trelvere looked at Tam more sharply, then shook his head. We'll see, boy. We'll see. He no longer sounded confident. Let's get him into a bed. He can rest easy, at least. Rand let himself be prodded toward the stairs at the back of the common room. He tried hard to keep his certainty that somehow Tam would be all right. But it had been thin to begin with, he realized, and the sudden doubt in the mayor's voice shook him. On the second floor of the inn, at the front, were half a dozen snug, well-appointed rooms with windows overlooking the green. Mostly they were used by the peddlers, or people down from Watch Hill or up from Devon Ride. But the merchants who came each year were often surprised to find such comfortable rooms. 3 of them were taken now, and the mayor hurried Rand to one of the unused ones. Quickly the down comforter and blankets were stripped back on the wide bed, and Tam was transferred to the thick feather mattress with goose-down pillows tucked under his head. He made no sound beyond hoarse breathing as he was moved, not even a groan, but the mayor brushed away Rand's concern, telling him to set a fire to take the chill off the room. While Rand dug wood and kindling from the wood box next to the fireplace, Rand threw back the curtains on the room, letting in the morning light, then began to gently wash Tam's face. By the time the Gleeman returned, the blaze on the hearth was warming the room. She will not come, Tom Marilyn announced as he stalked into the room. He glared at Rand, his bushy white brows drawing down. You didn't tell me she had seen him already. She almost took my head off. I don't know. Maybe the mayor could do something. Could make her see. Hands clenched in anxious fists, Rand turned from the fireplace to Bran. Master Alvier, what can I do? The rotund man shook his head helplessly. He laid a freshly dampened cloth on Tam's forehead and avoided meeting Rand's eye. Can't just watch him die, Master Alvier. I have to do something. Gleeman shifted as if to speak. Rand rounded on him eagerly. Do you have an idea? I'll try anything. I was just wondering, Tom said, tapping his long-stemmed pipe with his thumb. The mayor knew who scrawled the dragon's fang on his door. He peered into the bowl, then looked at Tam and replaced the unlit pipe between his teeth with a sigh. Someone seems not to like him anymore. Or maybe it's his guests they don't like. Rand gave him a disgusted look and turned away to stare into the fire. His thoughts danced like the flames, and like the flames, they concentrated fixedly on one thing. He would not give up. He could not just stand there and watch Tam die. Father, he thought fiercely. My father. Once the fever was gone, that could be cleared up as well. But the fever first. Only how? Alvere's mouth tightened as he looked at Rand's back, and the glare he directed at the Gleeman would have given a bear pause, but Tom just waited expectantly, as if he had not noticed it. It's probably the work of one of the Congers or a Coplin, the mayor said finally, though the light alone knows which. They're a large brood, and if there's ill to be said of someone, or even if there isn't, they'll say it. They make Sen Bowie sound honey-tongued. That wagon load who came in just before dawn? The Gleeman asked. They hadn't so much as smelled a Trolloc. And all they wanted to know was when festival was going to start, as if they couldn't see half the village in ashes. Master Alvier nodded grimly. One branch of the family, but none of them are very different. That fool Darl Coplin spent half the night demanding I put Mistress Moraine and the Master Lan out of the inn, out of the village, as if there would be any village at all left without them. Rand had only half listened to the conversation, but this last tugged him to speak. What did they do? Why, she called ball lightning out of the clear night sky, Master Alvier replied. Sent it darting straight at the Trollocs. You've seen trees shattered by it. The Trollocs stood it no better. Moraine? Rand said incredulously, and the mayor nodded. Just Moraine. And Master Lan was a whirlwind with that sword of his. His sword? The man himself is a weapon, and in 10 places at once, or so it seemed. Burn me, but I still wouldn't believe it if I couldn't step outside and see. He rubbed a hand over his bald head. Winter night visits just beginning, our hands full of presents and honey cakes and our heads full of wine. Then the dogs snarling, and suddenly the two of them burst out of the inn, running through the village shouting about Trollocs. I thought they'd had too much wine. After all, Trollocs? Then, before anyone knew what was happening, those things were right in the streets with us, slashing at people with their swords, torching houses, howling to freeze a man's blood. He made a sound of disgust in his throat. We just ran like chickens with a fox in the hen yard till Master Land put some backbone into us. No need to be so hard, Tom said. You did as well as anyone could. Not every Trolloc lying out there fell to the two of them. Yes, well, Strawbeer gave himself a shake. It's still almost too much to believe. And Aes Sedai in Emond's Field. And Master Lan is a warder. And Aes Sedai? Whispered. Can't be. I talked to her. She doesn't. Did you think they wore signs? The mayor said wryly. Aes Sedai painted across their backs, and maybe danger, stay away. Suddenly he slapped his forehead. Aes Sedai. No fool and losing my wits. There's a chance, Rand, if you're willing to take it. I can't tell you to do it, and I don't know if I'd have the nerve if it were me. A chance? Rand said.
No,
I'll take a chance if it'll help.
I'm gonna call tonight.
Aes Sedai can heal, Rand.
Might be back on again tomorrow night.
Stories. They can cure when medicines fail.
See how my doctor fish
Gleeman,
go.
you should have remembered that better than I. Gleeman's
Till
tales are
next
full of
time,
Aes
everyone.
Sedai.
Thanks for
Why don't you
stopping
speak up
by, and
instead of letting me flail
everyone
around?
has a good night and
I'm a
safe day.
stranger here, Tom said, looking long and